Welcome everyone to the first of a new series I like to call History Speaks. Now, today I'm excited to introduce a brilliant historian who's with us. She's dedicated her career to exploring the fascinating ways people understand the body in the past and how that history still shapes debates today. With a PhD from King's College in London, she studied how medical knowledge about sex and reproduction crossed borders in the 16th and 17th centuries. And not only has she studied in Brazil, France, Italy, and the UK, but she also leads a book club on bodily autonomy, perfect for today's discussion. So please give a very warm welcome to my guest this week, Dr. Julia Martins. Hi, Julia. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you, John. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm so thrilled to be talking to you.
Well, yeah, I can understand that, but I'm only joking.
Yeah.
I think for certain, we are going to be talking about things that I am not expecting to know much about. So I guess for the next half hour or so, you can count me as one of your pupils as we tackle various thoughts on gender and medicine and everything else in between, I guess. However, as I always like to start these discussions, I've got a really challenging question for you, one that you're not aware of, but this one is particularly challenging, I think. And that question is, why did you call your cat Pancake?
That is a good question. So my cat Pancake, who is just here, let me
Oh,
here.
there it is.
Pancake, ooh, there he is. He's just napping with me. But we couldn't decide on a name, my partner and I, because I wanted to choose a name from character from a book, and he is a musician, and so he wanted a composer, and we could not agree on anything. And eventually we realized that we both love food, and so we settled on something we both like to eat, and that's how Pancake came about.
It's a great name. It's a really good name.
He seems
Anyway,
happy with it.
let's get into your own history then with a question that I ask everybody who comes on the show. So how did you first become interested in history, and what in fact is your background?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So I grew up in Brazil, as you mentioned. I'm Brazilian, and my mom was always very interested in culture, in art, and history, and she worked as a French translator. And so I started to study French from an early age. And I actually went to this sort of French cultural institute, and the director was a history teacher as well as a French teacher. And so I started getting really interested in French history with him. And his lectures were just brilliant, and he would talk about many interesting women who I had never heard of before, French queens and whatnot. And so I decided to do my undergrad in history in Brazil, my undergraduate studies. And then from there, I wasn't really sure where to go for my master's. So I decided to do a sort of joint degree, a double master's in Italy and France, sort of alternating between both countries. And then after that, I decided it was time for a new country. So I came to the UK for my PhD in London at King's College, as you mentioned. And yeah, and then throughout this time, I was lucky to find out about recipe books and to fall in love with them and these medical recipes about the female body, about reproduction. And then I got interested in gender, feminism, history of medicine, alchemy, science, all of that. And today, I mean, I love doing research. I really love history in all kinds of ways. But I think that the thing that I love the most is public history. I just love making or trying to make history fun and accessible to a wide audience, people perhaps who are interested in history, but maybe don't have the time to sit down and read a monograph, right? And so that's why I started the blog and the YouTube channel to sort of share my passion for history.
Yeah, and it certainly shows. It certainly shows the. Well, it's hard to put into words actually what you do write about because, I mean, we will cover some of the topics in this discussion, but it is a fascinating. I mean, your background's fascinating for a start. And whereabouts in Brazil were you from? Because I went to South America about 4 or 5 years ago now.
Really? Oh, that's always interesting to hear when people have been traveling. So I'm from Porto Alegre, so which is in the very south of Brazil,
Okay.
and yeah, and that's where I grew up. I moved to France in my I think 22, 23 years old. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So you're well traveled, aren't you? Really? That's the good thing, I suppose.
Yeah, it took me a while to find the place where I,
Yeah,
wanted to stay. But
it's
yeah,
difficult because all different. I guess the cultures change as well, don't they? Everywhere you go. So I'm sure you found a difference since you've been in the UK. But
definitely.
along those lines, then, I'd love to touch on an area that often intrigues people when looking at the past. And I did do a video about this myself, about Victorian hygiene and practices. So, could you share some insights on how people approach cleanliness and which of those could you tell us about from, I guess, the weird to what would be considered today as being quite normal?
Right. That's a great question. And I think the history of hygiene is just so fascinating. I love everything that is connected. It's similar but different to what we do in the present. So I think hygiene is a great topic. And the history of hygiene is very closely connected to the history of medicine, right? So in the Renaissance, there were recipe books everywhere. Basically, they were a very popular genre, and they were about solving problems, right? So recipes for medicines, so things like treating gout or the plague. But there were also regimens. They were also very popular, and they were all about how to live a healthy lifestyle, we would call it, and how to prevent illness in the first place. And that included hygiene. So from antiquity, there had been this belief that the body's health was determined by the four humors, right? The humoral theory. And that could be attained, this sort of balance between the four humors, in part by controlling something that was called the non-natural things or the non-naturals. And these were things like exercise, sleep, diet, the air, your passions, so sort of like your psychological or emotional life, and evacuation. So I'm coming back to
Mhm.
hygiene. So hygiene is closely like linked to all of this, but especially evacuation because the bodily excrements included not just what we would automatically think, but also things like sweat and other bodily fluids and even vapors. So, so in this period, in the Renaissance, it was believed that food was digested, it was concocted in the stomach, and then it was transformed into blood and other sort of bodily matter. But there were residues from this process, right? And they had to be excreted through the orifices in the body. So the nose, mouth, the eyes, the ears, and even, the scalp and the skin pores. So if these impurities remained inside the body, they could create obstructions and they could trigger illness. So how would you go about like removing these impurities, right? I mean, besides bathing, keeping your clothes clean was seen as particularly important because the fabric would absorb these excrements leaving your body through the pores. And so linen undergarments had to be worn and should be washed as often as possible, regularly. And and that's something that I think people forget about how much importance was placed on the hygiene through laundry, essentially, right? Through taking care of your clothes, but also the hygiene of the mouth was really important. And it was fashionable for a while for gentlemen, especially, to have like golden toothpicks, which they would wear in like long chains around their necks, and that was like very cool and trendy for a while. But also the same goes with like keeping your ears clean, and the head. So combs were very popular as well because you could comb out the excrements from your hair. So we might come back to that later perhaps, but just to finish off your question, because I'm always like giving people homework in the sense of like recommending books. And this book is really good for this topic. I'm highly recommend. I'm always recommending it to everyone. And this is all about, a healthy lifestyle in this period. And it talks a lot about hygiene. So yeah.
That's good. That's really good. I mean, that's what you just spoke about there reminded me of a story. And I went to Stratford upon Avon. It's a number of years ago now, this. And we went to the house of Anne Hathaway. It is Anne Hathaway, isn't it? Who married Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Um, And there was a lady there. She was just a normal guide, and telling us about how things were back in that particular time period. And one of the things they used to do was put straw down because they only had stone floors in those days. So they'd cover it with straw to give it some sort of comfort, I guess, when you're walking around. But instead of sweeping the straw away when it was completely flat and gone, all they would do is then put more straw on the top of it, which obviously increased insects and disease and dirt and everything. And another thing that I'll never forget that she said was, in the coming to the end of the summer, they would, you may know about this, and that's something similar to what you've just said. They would wrap themselves in bandages and and then put goose fat over the top, and they would wear these bandages until the following spring because they thought by sealing the skin, everything, nothing would be able to get in. But the problem is nothing could get out either. So it was a real problem, and I guess caused a lot of disease and everything else. But that's just something I remembered from way back when I went to visit this house once.
That is so interesting. And yeah, I think people were thinking a lot about pores and what came out of them, and and dangerously what could sort of penetrate the body through the pores as well. So there was lots of advice about how to deal with that. And I think this idea of the porosity of the body, if we could say it like that, but the idea that we could be vulnerable through our skin, I think that's really interesting.
It is.
And yeah.
I mean, it is incredible to see how ideas around hygiene have evolved over the years, and yet some elements might still feel strangely familiar today. So, speaking of practices that have shaped our lives, let's turn to the realm of fitness. Now, I don't want to butcher this guy's name, but I think you pronounce it Mercuriali, is it? Mercuriali?
Yes, Mercuriale. Yes.
Mercuriali, that's it. He was a guy apparently from the 16th century who it seemed started the fitness regime. Possibly today we'd look at him as a first gym instructor. However, it does appear they had a limited audience. But why do you think his words still resonate today, even though his regime didn't cover women?
So he was a very interesting guy, Girolamo Mercuriale. And so he was a 16th century Italian physician, as you mentioned, but he was very ambitious. And he wrote in this book on the art of exercise, he wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, but he wrote something like, I have taken as my task to restore to the light the art of exercise, once so highly esteemed and now dead and forgotten. So he wrote something like that. And that was very much an overstatement, right? It's not that people stop exercising with the fall of the Roman Empire, only for him to sort of rediscover exercise over 1,000 years later. But I think the point he was making was that similarly to what Renaissance artists like Botticelli were doing with classical art, he wished to do the same with exercise and fitness. And so he made one important distinction, which I think may feel weird for us today, but he made a distinction between movement and effort and exercise. And the main difference was intent. And in that sense, it was very similar to what the Persian physician Avicenna had written. He wrote that exercise was movement that changed your breathing pattern, but also involved taking it sort of voluntarily in order to keep healthy, to build a sound constitution. So it had to do with intent, right? And that's the difference between people like washerwomen. They are doing a lot of physical effort, right? As are people like plowmen or sailors. But their goal is washing clothes and tending the fields and, sailing, not keeping their bodies healthy, even if there might have been, an unintended health benefit. But he thought that exercise should be taken with the intent of staying healthy. And that's because he was thinking, again, going back to that idea of the non-naturals, the idea of what kind of lifestyle choices you could make in order to remain healthy. And exercise was a big part of that. So so he was very much in favor of walking, of all kinds of exercise. But he really idealized the world of ancient Greece and Rome with these gymnasia with athletes, and he believed because that had virtually disappeared, right, with the fall of the Roman Empire, not completely, but
Mm,
mostly. And he thought that that should be sort of revived because exercise, he believed, could help the body expel waste. So going again to back to the idea of hygiene and the excrements, but also it could help strengthen the limbs and distribute bodily heat. And what I find interesting about him is that he's not interested in women at all, which for me is a bit it's interesting but frustrating because I am interested in women a lot. And he basically writes in the book that, this is not sort of not the place to explore that. He
mm,
just doesn't care as much, really. He wants to talk about exercise and men. But what feels very modern, I think, about him, thinking of how we think of exercise today, is that he had this approach that exercise should very much be adapted to the individual person, right? So he thinks that it should agree with the person's bodily constitution, humoral constitution. So there's no sort of one size fits all kind of exercise for him. It depends on your age, gender, the season of the year, lots of things. And he does also focus on moderation, which I think is interesting. He's not about like pushing yourself too hard. He wrote things like you should start with a relaxed and gentle exercise, like the difficulty should be increased gradually, which feels very reasonable to me, very moderate. And another thing that I think feels very like 21st century is that he thought that there should be ideally three parts of exercising in a session. So you had the preliminary part of exercise, so similarly, well, close to a warm up. Then the simple exercise, so the main activity, and then the terminal, which would be sort of a cool down, right? And I think that feels so similar to when you think of the way people exercise today. So yeah, even though he wasn't interested in the way women and exercise had any kind of relationship, I think he had a lot of interesting things to say, and his book was widely successful. And again, because I'm always recommending books, Vivian Newton is an incredible historian who wrote a lot about him. But a fun book that I discovered recently, very fun, is this one, Sweat, and by Bill Hayes. And it's just like, about the history of exercise, but he does talk about Mercuriale a lot. And it's a fun introduction to just how we think about exercise in the body and how things are not like even the very concept of exercise. It's not a given. It changes from, time to time. And I
mm.
think that's interesting. It keeps us like, we should be mindful of that all the time. I think as historians, we should think of what words mean and how that changes through time. So the way people thought about exercise in the 16th century, what they meant by that is not necessarily the same as what Victorian people might, right? So I
It
think, he's an interesting case study.
is, and what I can't understand is why did he concentrate just on men? Why was there nothing for the woman out there to gain a little bit of, exercise or just do something a little bit different from the norm? Why was that? Why was that the case, do you think? Or was it just a male dominant world and that's it? Women, they were down there and men were up there and that's it.
I mean, I think there are lots of possible explanations. I think women did exercise, like especially women at court. They were trained in many different arts, like archery. But I think he's taking as his model the Greco-Roman world of gymnasia. So he's thinking of athletes of the Olympic Games. He's thinking
Mm.
of a very masculine model. So he's just not as interested, I think, in women. But yeah, I think it is because he's thinking of the classical antiquity as his model, and most women wouldn't have even been allowed inside gyms, let alone train.
Yeah, that's probably true. And he's put on a lot of the things that he's actually spoken about. They have evolved over the years. They've not really changed that much because human beings were still human beings 300, 400, 500 years ago. There's nothing really different. Um, but anyway, let's move on from him, who is a really interesting character. The idea of personal upkeep has always been essential. So, speaking of which, let's talk about hair care, which I know we discarded women in the last part, but now we can obviously bring them in because women love having their hair done and they do invest a lot of money in it. So, in those days back then, besides using just water, what other methods were used historically to keep the scalp fresh and healthy?
That's a great question, and again, I have a friend who says that I always manage to bring everything back to medicine because I'm so interested in it. But yeah, hair care is again very closely connected to the world of medicine because of hygiene,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, quickly going back to Mercuriale, he wrote that before exercise, people should clean the body and comb their hair. So that's an important part of how he thought about exercise. And it's because all these non-naturals, the world of evacuation and the excrements coming through the pores of the scalp and the world of exercise, they're all closely connected. So they're all important for, staying healthy. So besides, as you mentioned, using water, using different kinds of soaps, especially solid, like bar-like soap, there were lots of ways that you could take care of your hair, especially for women. So as I mentioned, in the 16th century, recipe books were a very popular genre. And what I mean by recipe books, maybe I should have said that earlier, but recipe books are literally books filled with recipes, but the recipes are not all of the same kind. So they're not like a cookbook today with only, recipes about food. You can find recipes about alchemy and medicine and cosmetics and how to take care of your horses and how to remove stains from your clothes. They're all mixed together in these recipe books. And so there were lots and lots of recipes about hair. And they were particularly important because there was this overlap, right, between medical and cosmetic recipes. So because these bodily excrements would be expelled through the skin pores, especially in the scalp, it was important to keep your hair clean for you to be healthy. And the main way, besides water, as you mentioned, was through combing your hair. So and beard if you were a man. So that was crucial to staying healthy. Even men should even ideally have two combs if you could afford them to sort of avoid what we would call cross-contamination between hair and beards, because we are talking about excrements. I know it feels very weird because we don't see our hair like that, right?
Yeah.
We just don't, when we think of excrements, that's not what we think about. But for Renaissance people, it was. So in these books, there were recipes for what we would today call dry shampoo. So usually powders that would absorb the grease and then you would comb that out. But there were also conditioners to make hair softer and easier to untangle. And that's without mentioning formulas to change the hair color, right? So, being blonde, especially a kind of strawberry blonde, was very popular, especially in Italy. It was the ideal beauty standard. So, but you could also change your hair, like you could become redhead, or you could, for carnival, you could dye your hair blue or green. I came across a while back a recipe to dye your horse green, which I assume was for like a popular festivity, a carnival of some kind. I don't know. But so there were lots of recipes for that, which is not connected to medicine, but I found really interesting. And again, because I'm always recommending books, but this is my recommendation for this question because it's a very fun book. It's a very good read by Professor Jill Buck. It's a new, like fairly new book. And she talks all about like Renaissance women. And she does talk a lot about hair and about how Venetian women would sort of bleach their hair. They would wear these like like a big sun hat with a hole on top. So you would have your hair out in the sun with the product to make it lighter, while at the same time keeping your face shaded, protected from the sun, because you don't want to, if you're a Venetian woman in the 16th century, you don't want to have your skin tanned. And so they were very popular. And in this book, what I found interesting about Professor Berg's research is that she tries to recreate lots of these recipes. And that's really fun. I mean, it's for people who work with recipes, like I did for my PhD. It's really when you try to follow the recipes, you realize how little you know, and how little the recipe tells you in terms of like quantities and details and method. You know, it's a lot is left for like the reader to interpret, and it's not always easy. So she recreates a few like conditioner formulas and moisturizers for the skin. It's really fun. So yeah, I recommend checking that out if you want to follow like 16th century recipes in your kitchen.
I was just going to ask you, would the hair always be wet before they applied these potions and lotions, or did sometimes they just put it on and comb it through, like you say?
Ideally, for most of these, the hair would be dry.
Really?
And yes, yeah. With some oils, you might have sort of damp hair, but usually you're thinking of dry hair. And that was something that was taken very seriously. And as you mentioned, especially by women, it was also, and that's another thing that I find interesting about the history of cosmetics. It was often like a bonding time for women. You would dress each other's hair, so you would have time for like the hair care, where you would be with your friends, you would be chatting, plaiting each other's hair, applying these products, and it was a kind of feminine world. And so it's interesting because it would take sometimes hours. Sometimes people would use that as an excuse not to do something because, you know, I'm getting my hair done kind of thing,
Yeah.
which, you know, and people would understand, you know, and be, well, you know, she can't possibly, she's drying her hair. So, you know, in front of the fire or something like that. So she won't get out of her room to receive so-and-so. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's a real yeah, it's really interesting that. It's really good. I mean, there's a lot of things, and I'm sure the people watching this won't be aware of a lot of what you've just said, and I'm not aware of a lot of what you just said.
I'm glad.
It's just really interesting to hear this perspective, I guess. So apart from the practices for keeping hair and scalp fresh, it shows us the effort, I guess, that these ladies put into personal care even centuries ago. Now, turning towards health in a broader sense, I came across something called green sickness, also known as the disease of virgins, and I think it's possibly the first time we've ever spoke about sex on this show. So it's not something we hear about much today, but could you give us a quick summary of what it actually was?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a great question. So the first time I came across green sickness, I had no idea what it was either. It was in one of these early modern recipes. It was a remedy for it, and I had never heard of it. It was called in this recipe not green sickness, but like you mentioned, disease of the virgins. It's also known as chlorosis, depending on the source. But so, in a nutshell, right? Green sickness has a long history from antiquity to the 19th and early 20th century, even. But it became a diagnosis, quote unquote, in the 16th century, and then in the late 18th century and 19th century, it was widely discussed by physicians. But they didn't always agree on the details. The main symptom, the main issue of this condition was an absence of periods, so amenorrhea, an absence of menstruation, especially in teenagers and young women. Now, that in itself is not particularly intriguing. What got me so interested in this disease condition, if we can call it that, is that the usual recommended treatment, again, air quotes, it was marriage and ideally motherhood. So I was really intrigued by that. And this was all based on a very ancient understanding of how the female body worked, based on Hippocratic writings. And the idea was that it was possible for the channels around the womb to be too narrow, and so for the menstrual blood to be blocked inside. And that was believed to have serious health consequences. So menstruation should be induced. These young women, they should be made to menstruate. And even though there were lots of herbal remedies for that, it was also believed that one of the best ways you could stimulate menstruation was through heterosexual sex, which would open these channels. And then later, childbirth, even more so. So the reason why I'm so interested in the history of this condition, and I think it has been my most ever watched YouTube video, because it's so, I think because it's so strange. But I'm interested because this is such a fascinating case study. It tells us a lot about the relationship between medicine and culture, about how they shape each other. It's a reminder, I think, that medicine isn't neutral. Doctors are a part of their culture. They're influenced by it and they influence it. So the way diseases like these can be created and reshaped is just fascinating. And again, because I'm always recommending books, but this one is the book to read about that. It's a really great book. It's a short read, but it's really great, by Helen King, who is one of my favorite historians ever. And she dissects the whole story behind it. And because she's an expert on the Hippocratic corpus, it's really great because she goes all the way back to Hippocrates and then all the way to Freud, essentially. And she explains it really well. So, but I think what's interesting, and she does a good job in this book showing that, is that some of these really old ideas, we're talking like 1,000-year-old ideas, they can have such an impact on contemporary, or not contemporary 21st century contemporary, but 19th century, really modern history, and they show this sort of coexistence between old and new in medicine, which I'm fascinated by. This idea that technology and progress can coexist. They can be side by side with these incredibly ancient misogynistic ideas about the body, about how the female body can only be corrected by being married, And yeah, I think it's a crazy case study, but it's very sad to read about this. All these teenage girls being told by their doctors that, the reason why they're not having their periods is because they're virgins. And as soon as they're not virgins anymore because they're married, then they'll be fine. It's very much patriarchy in action. So
when did this particular disease, if you like, actually die out then, or is it still around today in certain parts of the world?
Not that I'm aware of. I think the sort of nail in the coffin in the 1920s, there were loads of articles in the medical press by doctors sort of debunking it and saying that it's actually pernicious anemia or other kinds of things. It's difficult to create like a modern equivalency. I think many people who were diagnosed with green sickness had all kinds of things from like endometriosis to IBS to anorexia to all kinds of things, depending on the case. But the doctors who debunked it from the medical perspective usually talk about anemia and how it's to do with that, So, but until then, until the, early 1900s, like even the 20s, people were receiving this diagnosis of chlorosis or green sickness. So, yeah, I think it's a reminder that, this is old history, but it's still recent history.
Really interesting what you've just said there, and understanding conditions like green sickness. It really sheds light on how historical beliefs about health and vitality, I guess, were intertwined back then. But on a related note, fertility was often a significant concern, and it seems there were many potions that were thought to help with that. So when it came to aphrodisiacs, what can you tell us about the potions that were once considered a good option towards fertility?
That's a great question. And again, I have a book recommendation. This one is by Jennifer Evans about aphrodisiacs. And it's just really a really cool book. But in my own research, what happened with aphrodisiacs that really surprised me was when I started going through the sources for the PhD, I was trying to categorize the recipes into things like a breastfeeding recipe, a conception recipe, a fertility, aphrodisiac, childbirth recipe. And I started to notice the overlap that there was, so I was fascinated by how closely connected these aphrodisiac recipes were to this world of fertility and conception. And that's because that's not how we think of aphrodisiacs today, right? We tend to think of them as being about stimulating arousal and perhaps increasing pleasure. But in the past, they were also really connected to fertility, and it's all about hotness. So going back to the humoral theory, which I know I've mentioned several times, but it's just so central to everything else. So So the body was understood to be composed of these four humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, right? And people were hotter or colder, drier or wetter, and it varied from person to person. But usually men were believed to be hotter and drier, and women were colder and wetter. So the womb in particular was an organ that could be too cold or too wet, too slippery for conception to happen. So it was also believed, just again coming to the idea of hotness, that sexual appetite itself came from, heat, hotness in the body. So these aphrodisiac recipes, aphrodisiac formulas, they tended to include lots of warming substances, which would prepare the body for venery, for sexual activity, both in the sense of facilitating arousal and helping conception happen, because that needed heat by making the womb ready. And that's why lots of aphrodisiacs were similar for men and women. Even though being naturally colder, women might need more of them than to make their bodies more fertile. And again, remembering that in the same way that the bodies were classified as hotter, colder, dry, or wet, the same would apply to food. And I think that's really interesting, thinking about diet and health and medicine and all of that. Everything is connected. So foods were classified as being hot, cold, dry, wet. And the way that you could regulate your own health through diet was by eating foods that were appropriate to treating whatever issue you were dealing with, including fertility. So if you needed to make the body hotter for sex to happen and for conception to happen ideally, then you would need warming foods. And they would be things like game meat, birds like pheasants, but also things like rocket, which has that peppery peppery taste, sorry.
Mm.
So black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, these were all spices that were classified as hot, so they could help. And coming back to the pheasants and birds in general, so and the same goes for goats, they were believed to be very lusty, horny animals, essentially. So eating their meat might transmit that to people.
Mm.
And I know that sounds very weird, and it's very close to, it sounds like magic. And in a way, it is connected to magic as well. And just briefly mentioning, I think it's interesting that other remedies could be recommended because of analogical thinking. So there was another very popular idea at the time called the doctrine of signatures. And in the Renaissance, that was the idea that the external appearance of things, especially plants, could give us clues about their occult virtues and qualities. So thinking of sex, of aphrodisiacs, phallic-shaped plants, so things like carrots and parsnips, were believed to help. Another idea that was popular at the time was that erection was caused by wind. And so wind-producing substance. So things that we would think are not the most romantic kind of foods, I guess, things like beans could be recommended because they would create wind, and the wind could help things happen, right? So these are all, they sound like very weird ideas, I know, but what I find interesting about Renaissance medicine is that they all have their internal logic. Once you accept the premise that you're working from, then they sort of make sense. I'm not saying that beans are an aphrodisiac, but that was the reasoning. And the last kind of category of aphrodisiacs that I would like to mention is things from the sea. Because Aphrodite, according to myth, was born from the sea, right? And so it's not by coincidence there's lots of seafoods came to be associated with sex, with fertility, with aphrodisiacs. I mean, just think of oysters, right?
Mm.
So in books of this period, especially recipe books, the recipes that are meant to inspire lust or to facilitate conception are very similar, and they tend to have a lot of these ingredients. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're trying to avoid conception, then instead of warming substances to make the body hotter, you could go the other way to sort of cool the body down, things like melons or cucumbers. Even though cucumbers are phallic, so I'm not sure where they fall in that. I don't know. I would have to consult. Now I don't think, no, I'm not so sure anymore about cucumbers, but melons wouldn't help, no.
Who would have thought that beans on toast would be an aphrodisiac?
I know.
It's just like, it's blown my mind, that one. I mean, this is an interesting glimpse that you've talked about there, about the past beliefs around fertility and health. But let's move now from that to from conception to early motherhood. And there's this tradition of a line-in period. Now, what happened to the mother and child over the line-in period, and what practices or care were involved?
That's a great question. And I mean, it does depend a lot on time and place. It varied a lot across Europe. For Britain specifically, I really like this book by David Cressy. It's all about the rituals around birth and all of that. It's really good read. But so usually in many parts of Europe, this was a time for women, right? So it was a time for female friends, neighbors, family members to come. And they would have been the ones who would have helped the new mother throughout pregnancy, but especially during childbirth, along with nurses and a midwife. And then after the baby was born, these women would essentially take care of the new mother and the baby. They were usually called the gossips, and that expression came from God sib, so siblings in God. They were the people who would be involved in the process, and they would play a huge role in this lying-in period. Now, the expression itself comes from the idea that for some of this period, and the period could last anything between 4 and 6 weeks, more or less, the mother would be in bed for some of this time. So she would gradually be allowed to sit up, and then she would be allowed to move around the room and then around the house. And that's all before the churching ceremony, which would be when she would be sort of reintegrated into the community at large through a special ceremony at church, right? With giving thanks for the healthy baby, for surviving the birth and everything. But before churching, she would be at home. And this was a world of women, really. And the thing is, I'm so interested in this, and it's frustrating because sources are not great, because women didn't leave as many records as men did for, most of history, as you know. But we do know that this was a period in which women would be eating, drinking, socializing around this new mother. They would play games, they would tell stories, and the bulk of the domestic tasks that might have been performed by the one who had just given birth would be taken over by someone else, maybe someone hired just for that period, or maybe the friends and family, depending on social class, on wealth, right? But this was a time of sort of, it would be, even though you had just given birth, and that's no easy task, it would be a break of sorts, because so the woman wouldn't be taking care of the house, of her domestic duties, but she would also be unavailable for sex. So she would be having a break as a wife, a break from sex, which was not only an expectation, but a duty to your husband, but also a break from the things you would normally do around the house. And it would be a time when this new mother would be taken care of by the women in this female network and the baby as well. So there were special drinks such as caudle, which is something kind of similar to eggnog. I tried it a couple of times. It's very, very sweet, a very sweet and rich drink, sometimes with eggs and lots of spices like nutmeg. There were things like groaning cakes, which had their name because they were connected to childbirth. There were special broths. There were all kinds of traditions. And in other places, like in Italy, in Tuscany in particular, there were specific objects that would be used, such as birth trays. And these birth trays, they would depict scenes of confinement, scenes of lying in, and they would be used to bring food to the new mother, to bring her sweets, drinks, anything. Now, this all sounds great, but it's not about idolizing the past. I think sometimes we are so eager to find this sort of lost history that we can fall into the trap of, things and thinking that it was easier than it was. But was one of the few moments in a married woman's life when she would be released from her duties and she would be taken care of by others, ideally her friends. So temporarily, the world of the home would be sort of upside down. And the same could be said about the birth itself, because the midwife would be the one in charge, right? Not the husband. So it is an interesting entry point into female culture, into the female world. But yeah, I wish we had more sources about it, but we have to work with what we have.
I think you've clearly highlighted how much care and kind of ritual surrounded the early days of motherhood. Um, Building on that, obviously the child's born, and breastfeeding, I guess, was often a crucial part of a new mother's responsibilities. But how significant was breastfeeding historically, and were there times when alternative types of milk were used? And I guess what potential risks came with those choices?
That's a great question, and it's a good example of how things were different for people across the social spectrum, right? Because if you were a woman from a noble family, or even just a well-off family, the goal of marriage was to produce heirs, right? And we know, and they knew, that breastfeeding often delays the return of fertility. Plus, you're not as physically available, right? You're taking care of your baby, you're not as available to your husband. So that's why most families, the families who could afford it, who were well off, parts of, the nobility especially, they would hire wet nurses. And they would be nurses who would take care of the baby, including breastfeeding them. And they would either live in the house, the family house, or they would bring the baby with them to their own houses. And so that the new mother, so that her fertility could return as soon as possible, and that she could conceive again as soon as possible. On the other end of the spectrum, for poorer families, then women would mostly breastfeed their own babies. And if a mother died at birth, for instance, the parish could pay for a wet nurse, or the family could pay for a wet nurse. Some babies could be fed by friends for free. That was also an option. But in desperate situations, animal milk could be used. And then people had different opinions about which milk was best. Sometimes sheep were chosen just because of their connection because the idea of Christ as the Lamb of God, the sheep had a sort of unique role in the imagination. And so sometimes sheep's milk would be used. Sometimes cow's milk mixed with water, sometimes with eggs, raw eggs, sometimes a bit of flour or bread. That would be called pep or papada, depending on the area we're talking about. But of course, that's not ideal, right? And so children could die due to a lack of, adequate nourishment. So yeah, and this is an interesting time to be thinking about breastfeeding, the early modern period, because there was it was very polemic whether people should breastfeed their children or not. So religious men, moralists, but also medical writers started to write more and more in the popular press against this practice of wet nursing and telling women that they should breastfeed their own children. And they would criticize them mercilessly for not doing that. And the main reason for that, the medical reason for that, is that so breast milk was believed to essentially be menstrual blood. So the idea was that you had your periods when you were not pregnant. Then when you fell pregnant, the blood would be used to nourish the fetus throughout the pregnancy. That's why you wouldn't have your periods when you were pregnant. And then after you gave birth, the blood would move upwards in the body. It would be concocted. It would be transformed into breast milk. And that breast milk would feed the baby. So that means that this is made of blood. And as we were talking before about the humoral theory and the idea that each person has an individual humoral balance and constitution and everything, that means that each breast milk is different. It's not the same being breastfed by your mother or by some other random woman. And so medical writers would say that the milk that would agree the most with the child would be the mother's milk. And then religious writers and people worried about good morals in general, they would say that because this milk, because they had this idea that milk was blood, it also carried characteristics from the mother. So they had an idea that the milk would influence, would shape the child. And if you were being given milk from an immoral wet nurse, maybe your wet nurse was having sex, which she shouldn't be, and that might corrupt her milk. So that was not as good as, the milk you might get from your mother. So there were lots of discussions about that and how breastfeeding should work. Now, this idea of passing characteristics was very important if you're thinking of dynasties and, of big, important noble families, because on the other hand, you also needed that woman to be fertile again so she could conceive again. So it's kind of an impossible situation. And then gradually there's more being said about the Christian virtue of chastity, of charity and morality and modesty, and all tied together with breastfeeding. So it is a difficult situation for women, because I'm sure that just like today, women who wanted to breastfeed couldn't or weren't allowed to, and and the other way around as well, right? So sometimes people just didn't have the choice, right? Sometimes women just didn't have the agency. It was sometimes beyond their individual control. And at the same time, there was this prejudice against wet nurses being kind of potentially dangerous. They might, especially if the child was taken to their house, to their home instead of the family's, they might not care for the child as much as the mother would, and then maybe the child could die. So there was this suspicion. And at the same time, they were everywhere. They were a part of life, especially in wealthy households. And they were one of the few professions available, to women. So it's an interesting point where all kinds of different things converge: cultural history and medical history and social history, So yeah, but I think for many women, it was just impossible to have like a good option.
I think there you've the practices you've revealed so much about the resources and choices available to mothers in the past. Sadly, we need to just go beyond that now. So when the child's obviously growing up a little bit, and there were situations when caring for the child wasn't possible. So what were the main reasons that led families to abandon their children, and how were such situations viewed in society?
That's a great question. And for a long time, there was this idea among historians following the work of the French medievalist Philippe Ariès that so he was a very important cultural historian, and I'm not saying anything bad about him, but one of the things that he did say, that he did write about, was that because there was such a high mortality, child mortality, infant mortality in the medieval and early modern periods, that people basically didn't love their children as much as we do today, quote unquote, that they wouldn't have been able to do that, that maybe it was not prudent to do that, with death all around them all the time. So there had been this idea for a while among historians that people love their children differently. And this has been criticized and debunked and dissected by lots of historians. And I am simplifying things a lot here. And, I do think that Ariès was an incredible historian, but I never really understood this idea that people might have cared less about their children in the past just because child and infant mortality was a much bigger issue then. So going back to this idea of abandoned children, I've always loved reading, and I've always loved fairy tales. And there are so many examples, right, of abandoned children, especially Hansel and Gretel. And we know from the story, the Hansel and Gretel story, the idea is that they are abandoned in the forest because their parents, they just cannot afford to feed them, right? So in this story, there's the idea of a real life concern of money, right? And that's true for lots of folkloric tales. So I think that this idea that maybe people just didn't care as much. I think it has been thoroughly debunked. And there have been so many interesting studies about economic and social history and the aspect of abandoning children from those angles, rather than just focusing on individual mothers and parents and families and how they might have felt about children. So yeah, we do know that usually when the economy was bad, when people were in dire situations, when prices were high, when bread was expensive, during long, harsh famines or the plague or long winters, foundlings, there were just more foundlings. There were more abandoned children. So there is sorry, excuse me. So there is this relationship between the economy and abandoning children. Sorry. And so this is another last book I wanted to share about women in sort of pre-industrial societies. It's interesting because we tend to forget sometimes. I think we focus too much on individual people and their cases, and sometimes we forget, the systemic issues behind them. But having said that, I mean, I'm sure some children were sadly just abandoned by their parents or babies, But, and this is where the Hansel and Gretel story is different from lots of other cases, is that real cases. So they were left in the forest, right, by their parents. But we do know that in most cases in medieval and early modern Europe, children and babies would be abandoned in places where they could usually be easily found and be taken care of, right? So places like noble families' houses, monasteries, convents, hospitals, and churches, right? Those would be the places to leave a child. And I mean, many churches even had foundling wheels or foundling hatches, and they were special places where people could, with anonymity, they could leave their babies or their young children to be found and to be taken care of. And going back to the idea of love and how people in the past also loved their children, many of these children would have notes pinned to them or tokens, objects, maybe telling a little bit about them and their family, whether, their names, whether they had been baptized or not, and just telling who they were, right? So these were not completely anonymous children. And thinking of London specifically, London grew enormously in population between the 16th and the 18th centuries. And it has been estimated that, over 1,000 foundlings were found each year. And that led to the creation of new institutions to take care of them, especially the Foundling Hospital, to take care of these children, right? So going back to mothers and parents in general who might leave their children because of economic reasons, I also wanted to just keep in mind that, and I think we can forget that people, especially women's situation, could change very quickly, right? I mean, becoming a widow or maybe being left financially unsupported by a husband or by your family, you could become ill or suddenly disabled, and all that could make it very difficult for you to take care of your children. So, yeah, I mean, I think children were and are abandoned for multiple reasons, for, societal pressures, maybe the mother wasn't married, to psychological, personal reasons. But I think that we have to be wise not to blame people too harshly or quickly. I mean, who knows, maybe if Hansel and Gretel's mother had money enough to feed everyone, they wouldn't have been left. I mean, I don't know. But I think it's what makes the story scary is the idea, or at least daunting, it is the idea that the people who are meant to take care of you might abandon you. I think it touches our very primal fear of abandonment. Right. But I think we have to remember systemic issues and the socioeconomic situation that might be behind an incredibly difficult choice like that. Right. So, yeah, going back to Philippe Ariès, I don't think people in the past loved their children any less than we do, even though the way we express that love is shaped by culture. Right. So I don't know, perhaps this can be sort of a lesson in empathy. Right.
I think as well, it's still a situation, sadly, that happens today, not on possibly the scale that it did two, 300 years ago, but it does still occasionally appear on the news that a baby's been left at a
Yeah.
supermarket or so yeah, it does still happen. But anyway, we've
Yeah.
had enough doom and gloom. Let's lighten the
Yes.
mood. Let's lighten the mood. So, Julia, where can people find out more about yourself and your amazing insights into the human body through the ages and any other social media sites you'd like to share? In fact, any information at all. I know you do YouTube, so we can mention that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I have my own YouTube channel, Living History, at Julia Martin's History, and that's the same handle for Instagram at Julia Martin's History, and I'm also on TikTok, and yeah, but basically YouTube, that's what I enjoy the most because it allows for more time. I think with TikTok it can be tricky trying to limit yourself to a few minutes. I tend, as you have seen, as you might have noticed, I tend to go on and ramble and add more and more tangents, and so that's why I appreciate YouTube. But yeah, but I also use Instagram quite a lot, and if people are interested in reading and book clubs, I also have accounts for My Body My Book Club on Instagram, and yeah.
I'm sure.
So
I'm sure that
I have the blog if people prefer reading rather than hearing me ramble on.
they'll be knocking your door down, Julia. They'll be knocking your door down. Believe me. So finally. Thank you so much for guiding us through these fascinating and sometimes surprising corners of history. I mean, it's incredible to see how much we've learned and sometimes unlearned over the centuries. But there's certainly much
Definitely.
food for thought in what we've spoken about today. And I, for one, appreciate you sharing your insights with us, especially me, because it's been a massive, steep learning curve for myself, but it's certainly been
Oh, thank you.
enlightening. So thanks.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you for, indulging me and just letting me go on and on. And yeah, I just love talking about little bits and bobs that are not as well known of history. I think
It's
it's just so
fascinating,
fascinating.
and
So
it
yeah.
shows that it just shows that you've got the passion for everything. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much for coming on, and as
Thank you for
always,
having me.
that's not a problem. And as always, to everyone who's tuned in, thank you so much. We've still got some more incredible guests coming on History Speaks. So if you love history, you're going to love History Roadshow. And don't forget to like, which is one of these, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss any of our historical stories. So until next time, keep exploring the past with us, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.